In the dim twilight of prehistory, before the rise of cities and the carving of laws into stone, the first humans walked a world alive with uncertainty. The forests were vast and indifferent, rivers ran with a voice that could drown out the faintest human cry, and the night held shadows that shifted with a will of their own. It was here, in these untamed landscapes, that humanity first learned to speak in a language older than words, a language written not with ink or chisel, but with the red pulse of life itself. Blood, warm and inexorable, became the first offering. It was more than fluid, it was a bridge. When a hunter knelt beside a fallen deer, when a parent pressed a child's palm into the soil, when a stranger's life trembled in the hands of necessity, the act was both humble and terrifying. To spill blood was to speak in a tongue that could be understood by forces invisible to the eye, forces that governed rain and sun, famine and fertility. These early sacrifices were not mere superstition. They were attempts to weave order into a world that seemed determined to remain chaotic, an instinctual plea for survival against a universe that did not answer easily. Archaeology offers fragments of this first language. Flint knives, ochre-stained bones, shallow pits where the earth had drunk deeply of human life. These traces hint at ritual as old as civilization itself. In some of the earliest settlements, burials were not simply practical. They were offerings. A carefully placed hand over a heart, a stone pressed upon a chest, the placement of food beside a body. All suggested that death could be negotiated, that the unseen forces governing life could be moved by gesture, by intention, by blood. And so the act of giving began. It was not always voluntary. Fear was the earliest priest, and necessity often the sternest teacher. Disease struck without warning, droughts withered the fields, predators stalked the children. In the absence of understanding, the human mind sought patterns, explanations, and remedies. If the river flooded or the hunt failed, it was easier, safer, to believe that life itself could be offered, that the gods or spirits, or whatever watchers inhabited the shadows, demanded a price. In that first trembling exchange, humans confronted mortality, not as an abstract certainty, but as a tangible, negotiable force. Blood was proof of intention, proof that the living were willing to act for the survival of their kin, for the favor of forces beyond their comprehension. These rituals, primitive yet profound, were both intimate and terrifying. A hunter standing over a fallen beast felt a pulse echo in his own chest, a rhythm shared with the creature he had taken. He was both destroyer and supplicant, predator and worshipper. In spilling life to the earth, he acknowledged the fragility of his own, the tenuous thread that tied human survival to a capricious world. Every drop was a word, every cut a sentence, every heart removed or blood poured a prayer in the oldest and most universal of languages. And yet, these acts were never simple. There was gratitude, yes, but also dread. Fear accompanied reverence like a shadow that never left. The first humans must have felt it, a shiver as they knelt beneath the canopy of stars, the scent of smoke and blood mingling in the cold night air, the distant howl of a predator or the rustle of leaves that suggested a presence watching. It was not cruelty that shaped these early rituals, but the recognition that life was both precious and precarious, that survival required negotiation with forces that might never explain themselves. Anthropologists suggest that, in these moments, the foundations of human belief were laid. Sacrifice was not born of abstract philosophy or moral contemplation. It was born of necessity and imagination intertwined. By offering something of themselves, humans attempted to exert control over the uncontrollable, to create a measure of predictability in a world that offered none. The act of giving life to preserve life became the first form of language, a code that transcended speech, a dialogue between the mortal and the divine. Evidence from burial mounds, ceremonial sites, and early settlements across the globe echoes this shared impulse. From the blood-streaked stones of Mesolithic Europe to the ceremonial pits of ancient Africa, and the earliest hearths in Asia, the human willingness to give life to unseen powers appears almost universal. The parallels suggest that this was not mere coincidence, but a psychological imperative. In the quiet of those firelit clearings, humanity learned that survival required more than skill or strength. It required devotion, interpretation, and the courage to confront mortality directly. And there was meaning in that confrontation. The act of sacrifice transformed fear into ritual, and ritual into narrative. A community that shared in the spilling of blood also shared in the stories that arose from it. Every offering was a story, every ritual a chapter in the collective memory of a people. It taught lessons about courage, about piety, about the tenuous bond between human and world. These early sacrifices framed the relationship between humanity and everything beyond its comprehension, a relationship that would evolve but never vanish throughout history. In reflecting on these beginnings, we glimpse the profound humanity in these acts. It is easy, from our distance, to judge or recoil. Yet in those first gestures, in the trembling hands and steady knives, in the prayers whispered into the smoke of fire, we see the origins of devotion itself, the desire to act, to connect, to leave a mark on a world that seemed indifferent. Blood was the first letter in a story that civilization would continue to write for millennia, a story of belief, fear, and the desperate hope that life could be negotiated with death, that the invisible could be persuaded by the tangible. By spilling life into the soil, humanity did more than seek survival. It began to understand itself as a moral and spiritual agent, capable of both destruction and reverence, capable of shaping reality through intention. The act of giving was never purely practical. It was an acknowledgement of our smallness and our courage, a way to measure ourselves against the vast, indifferent expanse of existence. And so, in the firelit clearings, in the shadows of primordial forests, a language was born. It was not carved in stone nor written in ink, but lived in pulse and vein, in the trembling of hands and the stillness of those who watched. Spoke of fear, yes, but also of hope. It spoke of mortality, but also of agency. It spoke of humanity itself, learning for the first time that even in a world that did not speak back, one could make oneself heard. The first blood was a word, and the first offering a sentence. In these gestures, small yet monumental, the earliest humans discovered that to give life was to understand it. And in that understanding they laid the foundation for every story that would follow, a testament to the profound, haunting, and enduring power of human sacrifice, even before history itself could write it down. In the stillness of those long-vanished forests, among the smoke and shadows, humanity whispered its first prayer. And the earth listened. In the earliest villages and open plains, the world was alive with presence. Not all of it could be seen, yet humans felt it pressing against the skin like wind before a storm. The invisible watched, judged, and demanded, and early societies sought ways to honor it. If survival was fragile, belief was not. Offering became the bridge between the human and the unknown, a delicate ritual that transformed fear into dialogue, desperation into devotion. The first gifts were simple yet profound. A handful of grain cast into the soil, the choicest portion of a hunted animal left on a stone altar, fire and smoke rising toward a sky that neither explained itself nor granted mercy lightly. These gestures were neither arbitrary nor careless. Every placement, every movement carried intention. Each gift was a question posed to forces whose answers were measured not in words, but in wind, in rainfall, in the quiet continuation of life itself. To early humans, the act of offering was never separate from morality. Giving was intertwined with obligation, an understanding that life's fragility demanded acknowledgement. Communities learned to negotiate with the unseen, the fertility of the soil, the temper of the skies, the wrath of predators. Rituals codified this negotiation. The more precise the gesture, the more life seemed to respond. The gift was not payment, but communication, a sacred contract with the intangible, written in the oldest symbols: blood, grain, flame, and the beating hearts of living creatures. Archaeological traces reveal this sacred economy of exchange. Pits filled with bones, ceremonial hearths, figurines left beside the dead, and offerings buried beneath dwellings, all testify to a world in which survival required devotion. These early practices were a dialogue across the boundary of human and divine. To offer was to acknowledge that humans were part of a larger web, that the unseen shaped existence as insistently as the wind shapes the dunes or the rivers carve valleys. Fear remained the silent partner in every offering. Life itself was both fragile and precious, and humanity could never fully know the desires of the invisible. Were the spirits appeased? Did the soil drink too little, or the fire burn too low? Such uncertainty gave every act a weight that was both solemn and terrifying. And yet, the fear was inseparable from hope. Each gesture was also a prayer for rain, a plea for protection, a quiet assertion that life mattered, and that even the smallest offering could be heard. The act of giving also shaped the self and the community. Participation in ritual offered structure, meaning, and belonging. Shared offerings created shared memory. The invisible became a witness to both devotion and communal identity. Every feast, every slaughter, every ceremonial gesture reinforced the bonds between people, and between humanity and the unseen. The gift was never merely material. It carried the weight of intention, fear, gratitude, and the desire to influence forces beyond comprehension. Across time and space, these practices reveal a common truth. Early humans sought not only survival but understanding. The world, vast and indifferent, could be read only through the language of ritual. Gifts, whether grain, fire, or blood, became punctuation marks in the stories humans told themselves about existence, fate, and the sacred. Through offering, the unseen was acknowledged, negotiated with, and even in some small measure persuaded. In reflection, these early gifts show the human need to act in a world that often refused explanation. They were expressions of devotion and imagination, of courage and humility. They reveal a civilization learning to speak across the boundary of the visible and invisible, to translate fear into language, and to make life itself a conversation with the eternal. In the shadowed clearings, beneath skies that promised both bounty and ruin, humanity learned the quiet power of giving. The offerings rose in smoke, sank into earth, and disappeared into rivers. And yet, the unseen watched, patient and eternal, and humanity, trembling, continued to speak. Long before laws were written, long before tombs were monuments, death held a presence that could not be ignored. It was at once intimate and immense, a shadow that fell over every life with quiet inevitability. Early humans understood its inevitability, and yet, in its relentless approach, they sought to make it meaningful. Death became a language, ritual its voice. To live beside mortality was to negotiate with it, to give it shape, and in some small way to render it comprehensible. The earliest societies confronted mortality in firelit clearings and shallow graves, in the careful placement of bodies and the offerings left alongside them. These gestures were neither trivial nor perfunctory. A hand pressed over a heart, a stone placed atop a chest, a ceremonial object beside the departed. All were acts of negotiation, attempts to order the unorderable. The dead were not abandoned. They were transformed into participants in the human struggle to find meaning amid uncertainty. Death, when ritualized, became a measure of civilization itself. Archaeology preserves glimpses of this sacred language. Burial mounds in Mesopotamia, ochre-dusted graves in Europe, and ceremonial interments across Africa reveal that death was always entwined with devotion. Every cut, every placement, every gesture carried significance beyond the practical. Life given or preserved in ritual was a testament to an understanding that death was both a force to respect and a presence that could, through careful attention, be negotiated. In these early practices, fear and reverence were inseparable. Mortality was a constant companion, but its inevitability demanded more than grief. It demanded response. To prepare the dead, to offer gifts, to enact ceremonies, was to impose human order upon the chaos of the universe. In doing so, communities not only honored their dead but also secured the favor of forces they could not see, shaping the living as much as the dead. The sacred weight of death extended beyond the individual. Loss became a communal act, a shared responsibility. Mourning and ritual bound society together, teaching lessons of courage, humility, and devotion. The dead were witnesses to the living, and their treatment reflected the community's understanding of morality, balance, and cosmic order. Every ritual was a dialogue between the mortal and the eternal, a careful measure of respect and fear, hope and obligation. Anthropologists argue that these rituals served both psychological and social functions. By giving form to death, humans could make sense of it, and by honoring it, they could reaffirm the values of the living. Ritual transformed grief into structure, anxiety into narrative. In the silent attentiveness of the community, mortality became not a rupture, but a continuity, linking generations through reverence and shared memory. Even in the smallest gestures, there was profound meaning. A carefully chosen grave offering, a hand placed gently upon a body, a ceremonial fire to illuminate the night, all reflected an understanding that death was not merely an end, but a force to acknowledge, to negotiate, and to integrate into human experience. Through these acts, early humans began to define what it meant to be alive, what it meant to belong, and what it meant to leave a trace upon the world. In reflection, the sacred weight of death reminds us that the human desire to impose meaning is as ancient as mortality itself. Civilization, in its earliest form, was shaped not by conquest or trade alone, but by the recognition that life and death are inseparable, that to honor the dead is to understand the living. Ritual became the language of mortality, a bridge between fear and reverence, between absence and memory. In the quiet of the ancient forests, beside the flickering light of fire and shadow, humanity first learned to carry death with care. Each burial, each offering, each whispered prayer marked the beginning of a dialogue with the eternal, one that would echo across centuries, shaping the way we remember, revere, and live. In the rising shadows of early civilization, power and ritual became inseparable. As cities began to form along rivers and fertile valleys, rulers discovered that authority was fragile without the weight of the sacred behind it. To command life, one had to command death. And so, blood became the currency of kings, a language through which divinity, fear, and obedience were exchanged. Temples rose like stone proclamations to both gods and men, their walls echoing with the footsteps of those who bore witness. Within these sacred enclosures, offerings were no longer private gestures of devotion, they were performances of authority. The act of spilling life in the name of the ruler affirmed a cosmic order, a hierarchy in which kings were both mortal and divine. To the people, to the gods, and to posterity, power was inseparable from sacrifice. Evidence from across the ancient world speaks to this intertwining of rule and ritual. In Mesopotamia, inscriptions and temple reliefs depict captives and animals offered to placate gods and validate kings' power. In Mesoamerica, the pyramids of the Maya and Aztec were stages upon which human hearts and blood became the ultimate testament to divine favor. And in Egypt, pharaohs were the living conduits of cosmic balance, their authority reinforced through ceremonies that demanded life itself. Across continents, the ruler's legitimacy was inseparable from the offering of blood. Yet these acts were not mere spectacle, they carried profound psychological weight. For rulers, participation in the ritual reinforced their divine mandate, aligning their personal authority with cosmic necessity. For the people, witnessing or partaking in these sacrifices instilled awe, obedience, and a quiet terror, the understanding that the king, like the gods, could both protect and destroy. Blood became a bridge linking mortality to divinity, fear to devotion, and human ambition to the mysterious forces that governed existence. Kings were often defined as much by their willingness to shed or demand blood as by conquest or counsel. Captives, criminals, and even members of the elite could be drawn into the sacred economy of sacrifice. Each act was a carefully measured assertion. This is what it costs to maintain favor, to stabilize a kingdom, to commune with forces beyond comprehension. The ruler's power was never simply political. It was metaphysical, enacted in the rhythm of ritual and the language of life surrendered willingly or unwillingly. These ceremonies also reveal a profound human truth, that the desire to understand and influence the universe often manifests in acts of violence sanctified as devotion. Blood was a medium through which mortals could negotiate with the eternal, but it was also a mirror reflecting the fears, hopes, and hierarchies of the society that wielded it. The line between devotion and domination blurred, as kings claimed both authority and divine sanction through the same gestures. Even in the grandeur of stone and flame, there was intimacy in these acts. The pulse of a heart, the warmth of life offered to sky and altar, the careful observance of ritual. These were the threads that bound ruler to subject, human to divine, mortal to eternal. Power, in its most enduring form, was never solely conquest or decree. It was the ability to mediate life and death, to translate human fear and hope into acts that resonated with the unseen world. In the flickering torchlight of ancient temples, amid smoke and carved stone, humanity first understood that authority required more than strength, it required sacrifice. Kings fed on blood not for cruelty alone, but to articulate the sacred order, to bind society, and to affirm that civilization itself demanded reverence. In those early altars, power was inseparable from mortality, and blood became the language through which kings and gods, living and dead, continued their dialogue across the centuries. In the shadow of temples and across the silent plazas of ancient cities, the most potent offerings were sometimes the most innocent. Children, pure and unshaped by the world, became vessels through which communities sought favor with forces that were vast, inscrutable, and often terrifying. To give a life so tender was to gesture toward the cosmos itself, acknowledging that survival demanded the ultimate devotion, a surrender of what was most precious. Archaeology reveals chilling glimpses of these practices. Small skeletons interred beneath dwellings, ceremonial sites filled with the bones of the young, and offerings carefully arranged to honor deities all speak to a ritual logic that is both alien and familiar. These were acts not born of cruelty alone, but of belief so absolute that the life of a child was measured as the most potent form of communication with the unseen. To ancient societies, children were not merely victims. They were intermediaries, their innocence amplifying the message sent to the gods or spirits. Fear, necessity, and hope converged in these rituals. Communities were fragile, existence precarious, and natural forces capricious. Drought, famine, disease. Each could decimate a village. In this context, the offering of a child was understood as a negotiation with the powers that shaped survival. It was a desperate calculus, one that placed the collective above the individual, and life itself became a currency in a sacred economy that measured worth by devotion, not age. The psychological weight of these acts was immense. Parents, priests, and rulers alike participated in ceremonies with hands trembling, hearts heavy with grief and awe. The act was a test of faith as much as a ritual of survival. By offering that which was purest, the community expressed both fear of the unknown and the hope that the gods' favor could be secured. In the pulse of the young, in the silence that followed, the living confronted the fragility of existence and the demands of devotion. Across continents, from the pyramids of Mesoamerica to Bronze Age settlements in Europe and the temples of the Near East, the pattern is hauntingly consistent. Children were sometimes offered at moments of crisis, when crops failed, when disease spread, when kings sought legitimacy through divine favor. In each case, the act spoke not only to the divine but to the human understanding of sacrifice as communication. Life itself became a language of negotiation, and the youngest among them carried the heaviest words. Yet even in these dark practices, there is a reflection of humanity's striving for meaning. Sacrifice, no matter how cruel it seems to modern eyes, was an attempt to impose order on a world that offered none. It was a way to act against uncertainty, to translate fear into gesture, to connect the mortal with the eternal. In surrendering a child, societies believed they were bridging the finite with the infinite, grounding existence in devotion as much as survival. The echoes of these acts linger in memory, myth, and story. Legends of child offerings endure because they embody the extremities of human devotion, the willingness to give everything in hopes of preservation, the tension between innocence and necessity, life and the unseen. Through these acts, humans learned the duality of existence, that fear could drive worship, that hope could demand unimaginable cost, and that sacrifice could carry both terror and meaning. In the hush of ancient plazas, under the gaze of stone altars and the sky beyond, humanity first understood the paradox of devotion, that the greatest offerings were often the most innocent, and that in surrendering the smallest lives, communities sought to grasp the vastness of the universe. In these moments, the pulse of the altar became the heartbeat of civilization itself, fragile yet unbroken, mortal yet reaching toward eternity. Rising from fertile plains, atop hills, and along winding rivers, the first monumental temples were more than architecture. They were the physical heartbeat of devotion. Stone was shaped and stacked not merely for utility, but as a vessel for the sacred, a stage upon which the rhythms of human life could meet the incomprehensible forces of the divine. Within these walls, offerings were not simply acts of faith. They were an orchestration of fear, reverence, and intent, echoing the human need to render the invisible visible. Across continents, the evidence is staggering. Ziggurats in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Mesoamerica, and massive ceremonial mounds in the Indus Valley all testify to a singular human impulse to contain the sacred within enduring stone. These structures were not neutral spaces. They demanded presence, ritual, and devotion. The architecture itself dictated the rhythm of ceremonies, guiding the living as they approached the altar, shaping how the offerings, whether grain, animal, or human, were presented to forces beyond comprehension. Every block, every carved relief, every flight of stairs carried both function and meaning, a tangible measure of human aspiration toward the eternal. And at the heart of these temples, life and death intertwined. Beating hearts, sometimes of the hunted, sometimes of captives, sometimes of the young, were offered not merely as tribute, but as a conduit for communication. Blood and breath became the language of divinity, echoing within the vast stone chambers, imprinting human presence upon the eternal. These acts were simultaneously terrifying and sanctifying. They transformed mortality into ritual, grief into ceremony, and fear into structured devotion. In the echo of a pulse or the rise of smoke, humans sought not only favor but comprehension, hoping that the unseen would listen and act. The psychology of these spaces was profound. Temples enforced hierarchy, obedience, and awe not through force alone, but through sensory immersion. The echo of footsteps across stone, the flickering torchlight against carved walls, the scent of incense and smoke mingling with blood. Participants were reminded at every step that life was fragile, that survival depended on alignment with the sacred, and that devotion was inseparable from mortality itself. Every ceremony performed within these walls was a rehearsal of human humility before the vast unknown. Yet the temples were more than instruments of fear. They were laboratories of meaning. Communities learned to order existence through ritual. The placement of offerings, the timing of ceremonies, and the selection of participants reflected both spiritual and social structures. Through stone, humans encoded memory, morality, and cosmic understanding. Temples became repositories not only of devotion, but of collective identity, shaping society as much as belief. Across civilizations, these patterns repeat. In Mesoamerican pyramids, captives' hearts were presented to the sky. In Mesopotamian ziggurats, animals and sometimes humans were placed on altars beneath watchful gods. In every case, the temple was both vessel and amplifier, a space where devotion could resonate with power, and where life, offered to the unseen, became a measure of civilization itself. In reflection, these stone structures are more than ruins. They are silent witnesses to humanity's earliest attempts to negotiate existence. Each carved relief, each altar, each echoing chamber reminds us that survival, faith, and authority were inseparable from ritual and offering. The beating hearts within these temples were not merely offerings. They were the pulse of a people, a civilization learning to speak to the eternal through acts of devotion, fear, and hope. Beneath torchlight and shadow, within walls that have outlasted empires, humanity first discovered that stone could hold not only form but meaning, and that the rhythm of sacrifice could make life and death speak to one another across time. In the earliest civilizations, conflict was never only about land or resources. War became a language, a ritual of blood and submission, where the captives and the fallen were transformed into offerings to unseen powers. The battlefield was both theater and altar, and the act of victory carried weight beyond the immediate spoils. Each life taken, each enemy subdued, was measured not only in conquest but in devotion, a currency in the sacred economy of survival and belief. Across Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and the Nile Valley, evidence shows that human life and war were inextricably linked. Captives were chosen for ritual. Their deaths were choreographed acts of cosmic negotiation. Kings and priests presided over ceremonies that transformed the horrors of violence into meaning, binding the fates of the living and the dead alike. Blood spilled in battle became a sacred medium, its resonance reaching from earth to sky, from mortal ambition to divine will. The psychology of war as offering was profound. For warriors, it was not only survival that drove them, but the understanding that each kill, each capture, served a purpose beyond immediate necessity. The army became both instrument and participant in ritual, executing acts that were simultaneously political and spiritual. Fear and awe interwove. Captives faced not only death but a cosmic significance that elevated their demise. Life taken in combat became a bridge to the eternal, a way to negotiate favor, balance, and order in a world that often seemed indifferent. Temples and ceremonial sites bear witness to this dark choreography. Pits filled with the remains of prisoners, depictions of captives in reliefs and carvings, and altars built beside the spoils of conquest demonstrate that victory and sacrifice were inseparable. The act of giving life to the gods or to the unseen forces of fate was not limited to the slain. It extended to the participants as well. Warriors and kings reinforced their legitimacy through these rites, asserting that their power was sanctioned, their victories predestined, their rule validated by both blood and belief. Yet, war as offering also reveals the human attempt to find meaning in chaos. The battlefield was a place where mortality was immediate and absolute, yet the ritualization of death gave it shape. Communities learned to order the unorderable, transforming the terror of violence into narrative and structure. Through the lens of sacrifice, war became not merely destruction, but a story of devotion, obedience, and the fragile negotiation with forces beyond comprehension. Across civilizations, the parallels are striking. In Mesoamerican societies, the Aztec flow of captives to the temples illustrates how conquest and ritual intertwined. In Mesopotamia, the display of prisoners and their ceremonial deaths reinforced the authority of kings and gods alike. In every case, war was never simply survival, it was a dialogue with the sacred, a negotiation where human life was both the medium and the message. In reflection, the understanding of war as offering illuminates humanity's enduring struggle to reconcile violence with devotion. It is a history not of mere conquest, but of belief, a story of how early societies sought to impose meaning upon suffering, to transform terror into structure, and to speak to the invisible through acts of extreme consequence. Amid the smoke of battle, the cries of the fallen, and the quiet of stone altars, humanity first recognized that the taking of life could be a conversation with eternity. Each battlefield became a cathedral, each pulse of blood a word, and each offering a testament to the profound, hauntingly human desire to find order, and perhaps favor, within the chaos of existence. In the quiet corridors of early civilization, fear began to take shape as law. It was no longer enough to simply offer to the unseen. Societies demanded obedience, and ritual became codified into order. What began as devotion hardened into expectation, and expectation became obligation. The sacred and the legal intertwined, creating a framework where transgression was both a spiritual offense and a threat to communal survival. Across ancient cities, from Mesopotamian ziggurats to Mesoamerican pyramids, temples and altars were not only places of worship, they were instruments of regulation. Priests, kings, and elders wielded authority not through brute force alone, but through the quiet terror of the divine. Sacrifice, once voluntary, became a binding duty. The lives of the innocent, the young, the captive, were measured against societal need and divine expectation. To disobey was to invite not only earthly consequences, but the wrath of powers beyond mortal comprehension. Evidence from burial sites and ceremonial centers suggests the scale of this transformation. Rituals became highly formalized, with precise timing, sequence, and participant roles. Every offering, every act of devotion was carefully prescribed. Deviation was dangerous. Disorder could be fatal. Communities learned that survival depended on conformity, that the unseen demanded structure, and that the sacred authority of law was inseparable from fear. In these societies, morality and obedience were encoded in ritual itself. The psychological weight was profound. Fear became a tool, shaping behavior and belief simultaneously. Humans internalized the necessity of the sacred law, learning to navigate both worldly and spiritual hierarchies. Every ceremony reinforced hierarchy. Every punishment underscored divine oversight. By aligning daily life with ritual expectations, societies created continuity in the face of uncertainty, turning terror into stability, dread into devotion. Yet fear was never purely oppression. It was a language, a framework for understanding mortality, survival, and the unseen. By codifying ritual, humans attempted to negotiate uncertainty. The law became a bridge, translating abstract cosmic demands into tangible human action. Obedience was devotion, and devotion was survival. Fear became meaningful, its weight carrying the lives of communities and the rhythm of civilizations. From Mesopotamia to the Nile Valley, from the highlands of Mesoamerica to the plains of Europe, ritualized fear shaped early governance. Kings and priests wielded it not as cruelty alone, but as a means to structure society, to maintain the fragile balance between life, death, and the demands of the sacred. Temples and altars became both stage and courtroom, places where devotion, law, and mortality intersected. Blood, smoke, and sacrifice were the language of compliance, binding mortal behavior to cosmic order. In reflection, this chapter of history shows humanity learning that survival depended on more than skill or courage. It demanded adherence to a system larger than itself. Fear, once personal and primal, became collective and codified. By surrendering to law as an extension of the sacred, early societies preserved cohesion, reinforced belief, and gave shape to existence in a world that often seemed indifferent. Amid the shadows of stone temples and the flickering light of torches, humanity discovered the paradox of civilization, that fear could govern, devotion could compel, and law could carry the weight of both mortality and the divine. And in that realization, the first order of society was etched, not only in stone and ritual, but in the very hearts of those who lived under its watchful eyes. Even the most enduring rituals, the most solemn altars, were not immune to doubt. Over time, questions began to whisper through the corridors of temples, across plazas of sacrifice, and into the hearts of those who once performed these rites without hesitation. The sacred, once unquestioned, began to show cracks, fissures where faith and fear no longer aligned perfectly, where the human mind glimpsed the uncertainty behind the ritual. This was not rebellion in the modern sense. There were no pamphlets, no written treatises, no public protests. The questioning was quieter, subtler, a tremor beneath the surface of devotion. Philosophers, prophets, and elders observed the disparity between action and outcome. Rain sometimes fell despite meticulous offerings. Crops failed even after the most elaborate ceremonies. And slowly, humans began to wonder, did the divine truly demand these acts, or had fear and tradition been mistaken for will? Archaeology hints at this evolution. Sites once dominated by human sacrifice show a gradual transition. Smaller offerings, the introduction of symbolic substitutes, or the cessation of blood rituals altogether. It is a record of doubt encoded in material form. Where once the altar received hearts and flesh, it began to receive clay, grain, or effigies. Humanity experimented with the sacred, probing its limits, negotiating its demands, seeking to preserve the dialogue with the divine while sparing life. The psychological impact was profound. Communities wrestled with faith and conscience, tradition and empathy. The human mind recognized a tension between survival, devotion, and morality. To question the altar was not just to question the gods. It was to confront one's own role in acts of violence, to measure the cost of obedience against the value of life. These cracks revealed the complexity of belief. Devotion could coexist with doubt, fear could coexist with moral awakening. Literature and myth preserve echoes of this transition. Tales of aborted sacrifices, substituted offerings, or defiant heroes reflect the growing awareness that the sacred could be interpreted, negotiated, and perhaps reformed. These stories were more than legend. They were morality, reflection, and guidance encoded for a society beginning to see the limits of ritualized violence. Humanity learned slowly, that devotion need not always demand death, and that reverence could survive the absence of blood. Yet even as doubt crept in, the sacred retained its power. The altar was no longer only a site of unquestioned obedience, but it remained a space of negotiation, a place where human intention met the unknown. Symbols replaced flesh, ceremonies adapted, and yet the dialogue persisted. Humanity had discovered a subtle truth. The sacred was not solely the will of unseen forces. It was also a mirror of human values, ethics, and imagination. In reflection, these cracks reveal both humility and growth. They mark the moment when belief became conscious, when ritual became subject to reason, and when societies began to reconcile morality with devotion. The sacred was no longer monolithic. It was humanized, tempered by doubt and guided by reflection. The echoes of these fissures resonate through myth, legend, and culture, reminding us that even in the presence of the divine, humanity must confront its own conscience. In the shadow of the altar, beneath the stone walls that had once commanded obedience, humanity began to speak differently. The language of blood became the language of choice, of negotiation, and of conscience. And in that quiet questioning, civilization took one of its earliest steps toward mercy, ethics, and the understanding that faith, even when tempered by doubt, could endure. As the centuries unfolded, the sacred language of blood began to change. The knife and the altar, once inseparable from devotion, were slowly tempered by conscience and innovation. Life was no longer always the price of favor. It could be represented, symbolized, or mediated. Communities discovered that the unseen could be acknowledged without surrendering what was most precious. The altar endured, but its language evolved from flesh to form, from mortal pulse to symbolic gesture. Archaeological evidence captures this transition. Sites that once bear the weight of human sacrifice show the introduction of effigies, animal substitutes, and ritual objects. In Mesoamerica, wooden or clay figures came to stand in for captives. In the Near East, offerings of grain, wine, or carved figures replaced human life. Even where human remains persisted, they often belonged to adults or volunteers, not the innocent. The sacred became negotiable, and symbolism replaced brutality as the preferred medium of devotion. This evolution was not merely practical. It was profoundly human. The substitution of life with symbol reflects an ethical awakening, an attempt to reconcile devotion with morality. Communities sought to preserve ritual continuity, to honor unseen powers, while tempering fear and violence. The sacred, once a rigid edict of mortality, became a dialogue shaped by conscience, imagination, and cultural adaptation. By transforming the altar into a space of symbol, humans preserved meaning without exacting the ultimate cost. The psychological implications were immense. Symbolic offerings allowed humanity to retain the profound weight of ritual, the solemnity, the focus, the dialogue with the eternal, without the trauma of human death. Effigies, figurines, and sacrificial animals carried intention, emotion, and fear. They became proxies for mortality, teaching devotion and obedience while safeguarding life. In this way, the sacred was both preserved and humanized, a reflection of evolving consciousness and ethical reflection. This shift also reshaped social structures. Priests and rulers, who once wielded absolute authority through the power of life and death, began to mediate symbolism rather than mortality. Temples became spaces of interpretation as much as obedience. Ritual performance emphasized intention over blood, devotion over destruction. Communities internalized meaning rather than fearing only consequence. The altar remained central, but its language had grown richer, more flexible, and profoundly more human. Across cultures, the pattern is unmistakable. In Egypt, offerings of bread, wine, and figurines accompanied the deceased, substituting for life. In Bronze Age Europe, animal sacrifices increasingly replaced human ones, often accompanied by symbolic gestures meant to honor the divine. Even in Mesoamerica, where human sacrifice persisted longer than elsewhere, symbolic acts, effigies, bloodletting, and ritual display gradually augmented and sometimes replaced the taking of life. The sacred evolved to meet both spiritual and ethical demands, preserving continuity while softening the cost. Yet substitution did not diminish the altar's power. The offering, whether flesh, figurine, or grain, remained a negotiation with forces beyond comprehension. Humanity learned that intention and devotion could speak as clearly as life itself, that the sacred could be acknowledged without blood. Through these symbolic acts, humans reconciled mortality with meaning, fear with ethics, and devotion with conscience. In reflection, the age of substitution and symbol marks a turning point in the history of ritual. Civilization had begun to temper devotion with empathy, to translate fear into expression rather than violence. The altar remained a stage, but its language was now flexible, moral, and profoundly human. In effigies, grains, and gestures, humanity discovered that the sacred could endure even when the ultimate offering, life itself, was spared. And so, across fire-lit altars and stone chambers, the rhythm of devotion continued. The pulse of the sacred persisted, now measured not only in blood, but in intention, symbol, and the enduring human desire to communicate with the eternal. In the quiet aftermath of centuries of ritual, humanity began to confront a new reality. Devotion did not always require the shedding of life. The altars, once drenched with the pulse of mortal hearts, gradually became spaces where faith could be enacted without violence. This evolution was neither sudden nor universal, yet it was profound, signaling a shift in the way humans understood their relationship with the unseen. The sacred could endure even when mercy replaced the blade. Communities that had once relied upon human sacrifice began to experiment with substitutes, gestures, and symbolic acts of devotion. Effigies, carved figures, and ritual foods became mediums through which intentions could be expressed. Blood was no longer the sole language of communication with the divine. Offerings of grain, wine, and crafted objects carried meaning, reverence, and power. These changes were not merely practical, they were moral and psychological. Humanity sought to preserve devotion while sparing life, to honor the eternal without demanding destruction. Archaeology records this transition in tangible form. In the temples of Mesoamerica, clay figures replaced captives in ceremonial fire. In Bronze Age Europe, animal sacrifices increasingly supplanted the human, often accompanied by symbolic gestures of bloodletting, fire, or music. In the Near East, offerings of wine, bread, and oil became central to ritual, demonstrating that intention, when paired with solemnity, could speak as loudly as life itself. These changes reveal a civilization beginning to reconcile faith with conscience, devotion with morality. The psychological dimension of this transformation is profound. For centuries, human beings had internalized a binary understanding. Life was sacred, yet the divine demanded its surrender. Substitutions and symbolic acts offered an alternative, allowing communities to maintain devotion while cultivating empathy. Ritual, once inseparable from violence, could now channel awe, reverence, and fear into gestures that uplifted rather than destroyed. Faith without the knife preserved the power of the sacred, while embracing the moral evolution of the human conscience. This shift also altered social structures. Priests and rulers, who had once exerted authority through the control of life and death, began to exercise influence through mediation and interpretation. Temples became centers of guidance, teaching communities how to honor the unseen through performance, intention, and participation rather than mortality. By codifying symbolic acts, societies retained ritual cohesion, ensured cosmic favor, and fostered social unity. The altar remained central, but its language had grown subtle, nuanced, and profoundly human. The moral implications of this evolution resonate deeply. Faith without the knife required reflection, empathy, and imagination. Communities had to consider the ethical weight of their actions, balancing devotion with compassion. In doing so, they preserved both belief and conscience. Rituals became spaces not only of worship but of moral education, teaching successive generations that reverence for the divine could coexist with respect for life. Humanity learned that devotion did not demand cruelty. It demanded attention, intention, and care. Even myths and stories reflect this transformation. Tales of symbolic sacrifice, heroic mediation, and divine acceptance of substitutes abound. Legends of effigies, grain offerings, or ceremonial fires illustrate a world learning to honor the eternal without inflicting irreversible harm. These narratives preserved memory, reinforced morality, and communicated the evolving understanding of what it meant to act in accordance with the sacred. Humanity was discovering that ritual could be both potent and ethical, awe-inspiring and merciful. Yet the transition was not absolute. In some regions, human sacrifice persisted alongside symbolic acts for centuries. The coexistence of these practices reveals the tension inherent in this evolution. The pull of tradition versus the rise of conscience, the pressure of fear versus the voice of morality. Societies navigated this tension carefully, negotiating between the sacred as absolute and the sacred as interpretable, learning that faith could endure in forms that were less costly to life but no less profound. In reflection, faith without the knife marks a pivotal moment in human history. It represents the emergence of moral consciousness, the recognition that devotion need not be violent, and the understanding that symbolism can communicate as effectively as blood. Civilization had begun to reimagine the altar as a place of dialogue rather than domination, a stage for reverence rather than terror. By embracing mercy, humanity preserved both the sacred and its own evolving conscience. In the quiet chambers of temples, under the gaze of stone gods and flickering torches, the sacred continued to speak. Its language had changed, yet its power endured. The pulse of life was no longer demanded. It was invited, honored, and reflected in acts of care, intention, and symbolic devotion. Humanity had discovered a new truth. Faith could thrive without cruelty, that the altar could witness mercy as well as sacrifice, and that the human heart could communicate with the eternal in ways both ethical and profound. In this revelation, civilization glimpsed its own potential, to revere the divine without extinguishing life, to honor the unseen without invoking terror, and to create a devotion that was as enduring as it was compassionate. Faith, once inseparable from fear and blood, had found a new voice, one measured not in mortality, but in intention, conscience, and the quiet power of mercy. Across the millennia, the ritual of human sacrifice slowly faded, leaving behind an echo that was both haunting and instructive. Where once the altars had trembled beneath the weight of mortal life, there was now silence. The temples, once alive with fire, smoke, and blood, became still. In that stillness, humanity was forced to confront itself. The consequences of belief, the enormity of devotion, and the fragile balance between fear and morality. The end of widespread human sacrifice was not sudden. In many cultures, the knife lingered alongside substitution, and symbolic offerings existed alongside occasional mortal blood. Yet over time, the necessity of life as a currency diminished. Communities discovered new ways to negotiate with the divine, ways that honored intention rather than mortality. The silence that followed was not absence, but transformation. Ritual endured, but it spoke in quieter, more reflective tones. It demanded reverence without terror, devotion without destruction. Archaeology preserves the record of this quiet evolution. Altars once stained red show only traces of ceremonial use, layers of ash, remnants of offerings of grain, wine, and effigies. Tombs reveal that the dead were no longer feared as instruments of negotiation, but remembered as ancestors and guides. Monumental temples remain, their stone echoing with the acts of generations, yet the pulse of human sacrifice has largely ceased. Silence, patient and eternal, occupies the space once defined by terror. The psychological resonance of this silence is profound. For centuries, humans had acted under the weight of fear, the belief that divine favor required blood, that cosmic order demanded death. Now that weight was lifted, leaving room for reflection, for conscience, for moral reckoning. Communities could honor the unseen, uphold tradition, and maintain societal cohesion without inflicting the ultimate cost. Humanity had learned that faith could endure, and even flourish, in the absence of mortal offering. This silence also transformed memory and myth. Stories of sacrifice, once recounting terror and devotion, became cautionary tales, moral reflections, and cultural memory. Myths preserved the memory of lives given, offering lessons without repetition of the act itself. The horrors of the past were encoded in legend, reminding successive generations of both the power and the peril of devotion, and of the human capacity for reflection, mercy, and change. In the social sphere, the cessation of sacrifice reshaped authority. Kings and priests could no longer assert dominance through the ultimate control over life and death. Power had to adapt, relying on mediation, interpretation, and guidance rather than fear. The sacred became more subtle, more nuanced, and profoundly more human. Temples, once theaters of mortality, now fostered community, ethics, and shared understanding. Civilization learned to function without blood, guided by principles rather than terror. Yet even in silence, the lessons of the past endure. The echoes of sacrifice remind us that devotion carries weight, that intention matters, and that morality can shape ritual. Humanity learned that fear need not govern, that mercy can coexist with reverence, and that the sacred can persist without violence. The silence of the altar is not emptiness. It is the space in which reflection, conscience, and wisdom take root. Across firelit clearings, deserted temples, and stone altars now touched only by wind and light, the legacy of human sacrifice lingers, not in the act itself, but in the memory it has left. It speaks of a world in which life was once both sacred and negotiable, and of a civilization that learned, through pain and reflection, to honor the eternal without extinguishing what was most precious. In reflection, the silence that follows is both somber and instructive. It is the quiet testament to humanity's capacity for growth, empathy, and moral reckoning. The altar no longer demands life, yet it continues to demand reflection. The divine, patient, and eternal watches still, not for the pulse of blood, but for the intention of the heart. And in that enduring silence, humanity discovers a truth older than ritual itself, that devotion need not be cruel, that reverence can coexist with mercy, and that the echoes of the past shape the conscience of the present. In the quiet of the altar, the lesson remains clear. Faith can endure even without the knife. Even as the altars grew silent, the echoes of the past lingered. The pulse of ancient devotion, once measured in the ultimate offering, now resonated through memory, myth, and human consciousness. Civilization had moved beyond the knife, yet the legacy of blood remained, a testament to fear, faith, and the unrelenting search for meaning in a world that offered no guarantees. To understand that legacy is to trace the contours of humanity itself, our capacity for devotion, cruelty, reflection, and transformation. From the earliest forest clearings to monumental temples, blood had been the language through which humans communicated with the unseen. It was the vocabulary of survival, the punctuation of ritual, and the measure of devotion. Kings, priests, and common folk alike learned that life could be offered to secure favor, avert disaster, and negotiate with forces beyond comprehension. In every sacrifice, whether of grain, animal, or human, the human heart sought connection with the eternal, seeking to impose order on chaos and meaning on mortality. Yet with time, the cost of devotion was reconsidered. The moral awakening of humanity reshaped ritual, substituting life with symbol, cruelty with conscience, and terror with reflection. Effigies, grains, and ceremonial gestures replaced the ultimate offering, transforming the altar from a stage of death into a space of dialogue. Humanity discovered that reverence need not demand the severing of life, that the sacred could be honored through intention, creativity, and ethical consideration. This evolution marks a profound moment in the story of civilization, the recognition that morality and devotion could coexist. Even as human sacrifice receded into history, its imprint endured in culture, myth, and memory. Stories of kings fed by blood, children offered at altars, and warriors slain in sacred war became moral touchstones, encoded in legend, ritual, and art. These narratives preserved both horror and awe, teaching lessons about obedience, fear, and the sacred, while simultaneously cautioning against the excesses of devotion. Humanity carried the memory of these acts forward, transformed from practice into reflection. The psychological weight of this legacy is immense. Societies learned the duality of ritual, that fear could compel obedience, yet conscience could guide restraint, that devotion could demand life, yet intention could honor the eternal without taking it. The pulse of sacrifice, once literal, became figurative, shaping ethics, law, and cultural identity. Humanity had begun to understand its own agency in the sacred dialogue, recognizing that the unseen could be acknowledged without cruelty, and that morality could coexist with reverence. Across continents and epochs, traces of this legacy can be seen. Ancient monuments, desolate temples, and archaeological remnants testify to the power once wielded through blood. But they also speak to human ingenuity, adaptation, and conscience. Substitution, symbolism, and ethical evolution reveal a civilization learning from itself, transforming fear into reflection, obedience into understanding, and devotion into dialogue. Humanity preserved the sacred, not through terror, but through the wisdom to honor life while maintaining connection to the eternal. Yet the legacy of blood is not merely historical. It echoes in the human psyche, in stories, in moral imagination, and in the rituals that persist in modified form. It reminds us that belief can inspire both awe and atrocity, that devotion is a force capable of shaping societies, and that conscience is the compass that guides the evolution of faith. By studying these acts, modern humanity can see the ancient struggle to reconcile survival, morality, and reverence, a struggle that continues in different forms even today. In reflection, the legacy of blood is a mirror held to civilization itself. It shows the extremes of devotion and the fragility of human morality. It speaks of fear turned into ritual, terror transformed into ethics, and mortality used as both medium and teacher. Civilization, in its earliest form, discovered the paradox that devotion could demand the ultimate price, yet human conscience could redefine the sacred without extinguishing life. And so, in the quiet of abandoned altars, beneath the shadows of stone temples, and within the myths that have outlasted empires, the legacy of blood persists, not as a call to repetition, but as a testament to reflection, mercy, and understanding. Humanity learned, slowly and painfully, that the eternal could be honored without cruelty, that reverence could survive the absence of the knife, and that the human heart, guided by conscience, could speak to the divine in ways both profound and enduring. The echoes of the past remain in memory and story, in the rhythm of ritual and the ethics of devotion. They remind us that civilization is not only built on survival, but on reflection, not only on fear, but on conscience, not only on blood, but on the wisdom to honor life while seeking the eternal. In this legacy, humanity glimpses its capacity for both destruction and redemption, and the enduring dialogue between mortal and divine continues, quiet, patient, and eternal.